You grew up outside Washington, D.C., but you spent your summers in Puerto Rico because your mother is from Puerto Rico. And I think in one of your interviews you say that going to Puerto Rico was like opening a door to another reality, another world,
Yes.
you know, another language, culture. And I would like to know if you see a parallelism between that experience of opening a door when you went to Puerto Rico with the experience of encountering literature or poetry in your life as a reader and also as a writer.
Yeah, I see them as one influencing the other, absolutely. So when I would go visit my family, sometimes this is like the 70s, so my mother would put my sister and my brother and me on a plane, or sometimes just my sister and me. We were young, and we would fly there to San Juan, and my grandmother and my cousins would come pick me up, and we would drive to Salinas. And back then there were no highways, so it would take 3 hours to get from one side of the island to the other, up and down those mountains. And essentially at that time, Salinas, this town, was very kind of removed from San Juan and from American culture. And so it was like a bubble, this whole other world. Being in that environment made me think about language a lot. I mean, I was always translating, and I found that to be really fascinating. There was always something that was kind of getting away from me as I listened, and I started to listen for context and nuances, allusions. I would listen for these tones, and so I started to kind of understand in other ways, multiple ways, and that was, I think, really helpful for me later as a writer. I mean, I don't think that I was kind of conscious of it. I just think I had developed a skill or a way of thinking about language. My grandmother exposed me to poetry and literature. She and I talked a lot about it. When she would come home, she would get in bed and read from one of her books on her nightside table. And I wanted to be near her, so I would kind of walk by her bedroom door, and she would invite me in, and I would climb into the bed, and she would talk about whatever she was reading. Some of those conversations with her are the most vivid that I can recall. And I learned a lot about her because she would talk about why a poem mattered to her. And she'd talk about the poet, and it gave me insight into what was important to her and what was, who she was, her history. And in that, she would also talk about poetic elements, and I could start to see how literature and poetry in particular could move somebody.
The reality of being in a bilingual context or being bilingual, it forces you to pay acute attention to language,
Yes.
like the value of meaning. Oh, this means this here, but the translation doesn't mean the same.
Exactly.
So you start to associate value to the meaning, and you pay attention to everything. And I think that being hyper alert about that doesn't happen in other contexts.
Yes, so the other component to this story, or I think important element, is that my father never spoke Spanish. So in the home, my mother would often speak to me and my siblings in Spanish, and my father was kind of excluded a bit from that. I mean, it wasn't ever anything important, maybe like go get your shoes or eat your lunch, whatever. But I was aware of who was invited into that conversation and who wasn't. And I was also aware of, like when my father would sometimes say, "What'd she say? And I would have to translate it. And I remember thinking, if I use this word, it doesn't capture the tone.
Yes.
Like my mom would sometimes be really witty or be making a joke, or there'd be like a little barb in there,
Yes, yes.
And I would think, if I use this word, I'll capture the barb. But if I don't, and then there was the question of, do I want my father to know about the barb or not? So already I was making a lot of choices and thinking about a lot of elements that I think about in poetry.
You have published 3 poetry books, a question of gravity and light, the foundling will, and forget the body this failure. And I find certain elements that appear in these three books. One of them is what I call the empty space. Many of your poems present a scene, sometimes it's very small. The poem gives enough information for the reader to engage with the poem, but there is a lot of empty space. So the reader has to complete the poem with his or her own emotional background, life experience. Victoria Chang says that your poems are sparse, and Phyllis Levin says that your poems are spare. I would like to know, how do you manage that empty space so the poem is not too empty or too removed, almost non-accessible for the reader?
I think our poems are a lot smarter than we are. And our subconscious mind is making things happen, drawing connections, conveying things that we might not be aware of at first. You know, maybe years later you look back at a poem, you're like, oh, I didn't realize. And so what ends up happening, I think, when I try and give too much is I reduce the poem to much less than what it wants to be. And I found that oftentimes the gesture, like a small image, a small gesture will convey everything I needed to say and more. And it might be that I describe something and the reader doesn't know exactly like what the narrative background is, but I don't really care about that. You know, they get the feeling that I'm trying to convey, the complexity of emotions that maybe even are contradicting one another.
Yeah.
I just taught a chapter from The Art of Description by Mark Doty. And in it, he's looking at, in this chapter, he's looking at Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish. And what he says is, what he notes is that there are like 6 lines of narrative. The rest is description of the fish. And at one point, the camera of the poem kind of zooms in on the fish's lip, where there are 5 hooks. And there's such a clear identification between the speaker of the poem and the fish that, you know, this fish represents a survivor. This fish represents someone who's gotten free from that hook multiple times. Mm-hmm. And he says, we don't need to know what the speaker's hooks are, but we know that the speaker has broken the line multiple times, mm-hmm. right? And that felt so true to me when I read that chapter, that's how I really want to approach poems. I feel that the poems often best capture what I'm aiming for when I don't get in the way of the poem.
Would you mind reading a poem from your book, A Question of Gravity and Light? I think this poem is a good example of this empty space.
Sure. And though we know it does no good, all morning chongos cross the yard. Otherwise, a lizard on the branch, his throat a red balloon. And at the bottom of the hill, a boy. Surely the bus has come and gone. This has nothing to do with her. Meanwhile, the clouds won't give. The roosters won't stop crying. Someone says sirena, and you know the word from the story she told, slowly, without anger. Why, my skin, lifting her sleeve. Look, a finger in the air to say, listen. Then, pointing out the window, over there, for hours in the sun, where she'd swim. They said, you'll grow fins and won't come back, which is what it means, which is what happened. From shore, they saw her sink, a girl. What does it matter now if her dress hung on a branch or bloomed about her? And who is left to say? She lies on a bed across the sea. This was well before the pier was built or washed away plank by plank. The wind, you can almost hear the wind. They must have called her name. They must have called and called her name.
With the empty space, the other element that I think is a constant presence in your poetry is the sense of intimacy. I always think of the poet Luis Cernuda. When I read Cernuda for the first time, I thought, oh, Luis Cernuda is talking to me, like just to me. It was like a private conversation between the two of us. And quoting Victoria Chang again, she says about your poems that they feel like they are whispered into our ears, like the experience of poetry as somebody talking to us personally. When did you discover that sense of intimacy? When you were a reader, like when you were, starting being a poet, or something happened that, oh, this is the texture I want.
Or one of the reasons why I think my poems are quiet is because when I came to poetry, I was really trying not to tell someone something, but to understand something. And I was trying to understand something about myself.
Okay.
I was in the closet. And so I think after like all the shame and, confusion, I started to listen instead to the voice inside me. And it was a long process, like many, many years. But I started to trust that voice. So coming to poetry was a way to understand myself, not a way to tell anybody how to feel or what to think. And for that reason, I think that's why I keep going to poetry. I mean, it's not like I figured it out.
Of course, yeah.
And I stopped writing poetry. It's like every time I think I've got. I mean, really, a poem is like you understand something for that moment. A week later, you might have a better understanding of something, and so you keep going back to poetry.
Yeah. The quiet voice was the wise voice in your case.
There
was a wisdom that you were.
And it's not even me. That's not me. That's some other thing happening in me. I don't. I often tell my students my poems are much smarter than I am because I can't think through something and understand it in its complexity as well as I can, I can
let it happen.
Yeah, exactly. It's so limited. Yeah.
So, as an example of this intimate voice, do you mind reading two poems from "Forgive the Body, This Failure"? One is "Communion," and the other one is "A Simple Proof."
Sure. Communion. They open their mouths because hunger speaks for the spirit. You know this by the way they close their eyes, how they push the world away, all that light through the window, unbearable to watch, as watching two people say goodbye at the airport is, almost, the public display of grief, how they hold each other in their private dark, which is its own brief prayer. A simple proof. The crane's long arm lifts the beam into the air as men become the hammer in the hand, the level or the drill. They build a shadow in the field. They build a room our sun at dusk stoops in the door to look into. That dark. I'll miss the grass, he says, closing his eyes, and lets a stillness hold the frame of the thought in his mind. The two poems that you've picked, I think, are speaking to the subject of poetry, really, in my mind, in a way that's important to me. One is how poetry can help us share our private darkness, our grief, and the other one, how we can close our eyes and bring back something that we've lost.
Something also that happens often in your poems many of them have a turn. Like the poem may start with an abstract note or observation, but then it lands in something very specific, very concrete. And I pay attention to that because sometimes I try to do it in my own poems, but I am terrified because I am afraid that when the turn happens, the poem is going to fly away.
Yes.
And it's going to disappear.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions for that, to prevent that disappearance?
I think the turn is the most exciting part of a poem. I love the turn. It's my favorite part. Because that's where the poem almost like falls into what it wants to be a lot of the times. Like, you know, a lot of times I'm writing and I don't know what I'm getting at. The turn is where it kind of often reveals itself to me. And as an editor and as a teacher, the poems that I find most disappointing are the ones that fail to turn. And I think sometimes it's because, and I've done this before, so I speak from experience, where what I've written is pretty good, and I'm afraid that if I turn, it's going to fall apart. But if I haven't gotten to what is really important to me, then I don't really actually care about the poem so much. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't mean anything to me. It's an exercise in writing, not really what I hope a poem is going to do. So I often push my students to turn at least twice, because what happens is then they turn like, I did it. I pushed myself beyond what I already knew. Right, that's what the turn allows, is like to push yourself into the unknown. But then I think, well, what happens if you do that again? Then where will you go? Then they're petrified, but that's where you want to be, I think. And so two things that Phyllis Levin, who was just a spectacular poet, she was my mentor, she's just a brilliant mind. Two things she said to me that I'll never forget. One is, that the English sonnet, which has the very noticeable turn after the 12th line, kind of contradicting or challenging the first 12 lines, that English sonnet often has another turn, which she calls a ghost turn, after the 8th line, which is a nod to the Italian sonnet, right? It's kind of a nod to the tradition. And so what ends up happening in 14 lines, you have two substantial movements, right? And so the writer has to push themselves beyond the original idea twice. So that I always think of the ghost turn and the turn of the sonnet, how it's kind of embedded in the tradition. The other thing she said to me once, took the class, she said, I was just one of the, mentees listening to her. She said, do you want to write 100 good poems or one great poem? And I just never forgot that.
All these constant elements I find in your work, the empty space, the turn, the intimacy, they happen simultaneously. It's not like one poem is about this.
Right.
All poems, they have these elements happening at the same time. And then there's something else that I don't have a name for it. I call it, could be called like the power of the word. There is something about the way the poems present what other people say. We hear in the poems, we hear what your mother says, what your son says, what your friends. It's a lot of voices that are incorporated. And also there is a quality of the word as something that when is said, when we name something, that something happens. You create by naming. And there are two poems. One is After You've Been Gone a Long Time, and the other one is An Argument. And both of them, I think they are good examples of this ability to, by saying something, it becomes real.
After you've been gone a long time. There are no rubies here, but saying so brings one to mind, and they aren't petals as much as one furled bud with a very long stem. Ants take everything away, little by little, before you know. You came home briefly, for instance, and I was asleep, so it was as though you hadn't come at all, but something was missing. More time, I thought, might be like more water and make it taste less bitter, but only made it more to drink. Sometimes I can't bear waiting. If you were here, you'd see what I mean, someone staring off all the time. Once, when I fell, my mother gasped, which only made me cry louder, and people gathered to see fear that looked like pain. That's what I'm trying to say. The neighbors mow the yard, and it sounds like a plane overhead, where everything is clear.
I love the opening line, when the ruby thing. I think it's fabulous.
Thank you. There are no rubies here, but saying so brings one to mind.
Yes, yeah.
And that is
By
it.
saying something, it happens.
Yes, it becomes clearer, and that's really what in many ways, that's what the poem is doing. It's kind of bringing kind of insight into the speaker's consciousness. Eclogue, an argument. Say brush, and I see nothing but brush. And if you say river, then let the river divide the brush in two. How deep must a river be to not be a creek? And can a creek be a river part of the year after snow melts on the mountain or heavy rain? Perhaps a river is defined not by depth, but the distance between two banks or the volume of water that enters another body of water. Who decides? A green hill rises on the other side, much like the hill on this side. Behind the hills are more hills, I imagine, and beyond that, I really can't say. Oh my gosh, I remember immediately, it brings it all back. But it's this trying to understand, and kind of, it's true, by naming something, you get a little bit closer. But it's the gesture of, again, witnessing the mind, trying to define things, understand things, and then ultimately, you reach a limit to your own understanding of why something is named something or not.
So yes, we have one last poem.
Okay, all right. I'm going to read a poem from my next book. It's called Rara Avis. It was going to be called Fatherland, but I changed it at the last minute. And it is going to be published with Four-Way Books in 2024. And these poems, a lot of things happen in these poems, right? Sometimes I'm drawing on older techniques, but one of the things I found myself gravitating toward was the discursive poem. I had relied so heavily on the spare poem of cutting and cutting away.
The fragment.
Yes, and the fragment. I thought, what would happen if I gave more than anyone really asked for? And then what might I discover there? So here again, you see a kind of turn between books from the spare to the discursive. ¿Qué significa? I thought it'd be cooler here in late June. But all night I'm kicking off the sheets and pulling them back over my body in the stillness of my room, until I remember suddenly those summers as a boy lying in the twin bed with you. That was before the highway, when one needed to drive up and down the mountains to get from one side of the island to the other, and Salinas, where the fishing nets hung to dry in branches along the shore, and we swam in a clearing among the mangroves, or rocked in a hammock behind the house where my mother and your father were born, still seemed untouched by America. Sometimes at the bakery, or with the woman who sold lottery tickets outside the restaurant, or as the men drove us in the back of their trucks past the sugarcane fields. Not understanding a word or turn of phrase, a joke someone made, I'd ask, ¿Qué significa? But it was already over, or too hard to explain, you'd say. I grew homesick for English. One summer at the movies you cried so hard it scared me, the screen lighting your wet face. One summer, sprawled out on the floor in front of the TV in our bathing suits, we began to wrestle, laughing until our hands, then our mouths moved across our bodies, driven by a force we let guide us. Then someone stopped, and we lay in the sunlit room, breathing hard. Someone must have gotten up and walked away. Someone must have made small talk until we could pretend it never happened. Quiero verte, you said on the phone years later, both of us now with children of our own. And when I made it back one day to the island, I drove to your house, knocking on the large door at the agreed-upon time, but no one answered. The flamboyant trees were in bloom, their bright red blossoms scattered on the street, and it didn't take long to get back to my hotel. But I got lost. I'd never been to that part of the city, and so much had changed.
Thank you very much, Blas.
Thank you. What a pleasure.